Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Methods Guru for SAGE Methodspace, and I'm pleased to be joined here today with Jan Eichhorn, and he's going to talk a little bit about survey research and sampling and discuss his new book. But before we get started, if you are new to Methodspace, this is a blog community sponsored by SAGE Publishing, and we are interested in everything to do with designing, planning, conducting, analyzing research, writing about it, sharing results in ways that will make a difference. And you can see at the heart of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are an experienced researcher or a brand new researcher, we all have something to learn. So why don't you just start by introducing yourself, and then we can talk a little bit about survey research and sampling and your new book.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Jan Eichhorn. I'm a senior lecturer. That's the equivalent of an associate professor at the University of Edinburgh, where I work in the social policy department. I focus in my research specifically on heterodox economic ideas and challenging classic economic assumptions in people's behavior. But I also work extensively on political engagement, political participation, largely through large-scale surveys. And besides my work as an academic, I also am the research director of a non-profit independent think tank in Berlin called Depart, through which I put a lot of that research into practice with policymakers, NGOs, and so on.
Well, and our readers are interested both in the kind of academic side and in some of the more applied and practical approaches. So I'm glad that you're able to join us and talk about some of these things. So why don't we just start with the very basics and define some of the key terms like survey and questionnaire and sampling that are kind of at the heart of your book.
Absolutely. It's one of those interesting things because people throw around a lot of these words very often. So you often actually don't hear people talk about surveys, but rather talk about polling and polls. And I discussed that a bit in the book as well, because they are effectively the same thing, but often a poll is something really quick, something that's done very fast, that's really short, just a few questions, the things you see in a newspaper maybe picked up. Where surveys typically refer to something longer. The important bit is a survey consists of many, many activities and parts. So you have to develop a sample, you have to recruit your sample, but you also have to design a questionnaire that formulates the sort of questions that will be asked, that might need to be programmed into an online tool, for example. So the survey is basically the big thing. That's everything together that gives you those results at the end, the data that you might want to analyze. A big, big part of that survey, on the one hand, is your sample. So the sample, that's in social surveys, the people who you are interviewing. And it's a big question. Who do you want to interview? What sort of group do you want to represent through your sample? And then you have the questionnaire. The questionnaire is the summary of all the questions, the formulations with the answer options that you then want to ask those people. So yeah, that's kind of the breakdown of those terms. But when you hear poll or polling, that is basically the same as surveying, just that polling typically refers to something quicker most times.
Quicker and probably much narrower.
Usually, yes.
You're not going to get at kind of some of the background or the contextual kinds of experiences that might come through in a survey, and that's a more robust process.
Exactly. But even so, for example, a classic polling type thing is if a newspaper wants a very quick answer, there's a big event happening in the world, and they want to ask 2 or 3 questions to people about that event, but maybe also know their gender, their age, so they can report on that quickly. That would be kind of a quick poll. Having said that, you get polls with very good data quality and polls with very bad data quality, and you get surveys with very good and very bad quality. So just because it's quick doesn't have to mean that it's bad in terms of quality. And it's one of the things that I try in the book to work out, also to look out for. It's also, just to say, based on what you've said, one of the reasons why I hope the book is useful not just to academics, because a lot of people commission surveys or polls, people in government, NGOs, journalists, and even even when you do something a bit smaller in scope and not a big 3-year academic project, but maybe something that is done over a few weeks, there's still a lot of things that can go right or can go wrong. So I hope the book is accessible enough and short enough for people to get all the important bits out of it so that they can apply them.
So for someone who is just starting to think about doing this kind of research, what would be the first place to start? Should they start by thinking about what the sample population would be, or should they start by thinking about the research questions that they think a survey could answer?
I think the first thing is, I would say with any good research project, qualitative, quantitative, start with the research questions overall. What are you trying to find out? The moment you jump into which specific question I might ask or which specific person I want to ask, you might already narrow your thinking down quite a lot, because effectively, ideally, your research question should determine both what sort of sample you're looking for and what sort of questions you ask. Because the research question, you might ask a research question that is, you realize, well, what I'm trying to find out is kind of a general trend in the population, for example. You might ask a research question that talks about the specific experience that only some people are affected by, which might tell you that you need to look at a different sample. But if that's the case, it might also tell you that it's a really sensitive topic. You might be talking about something that is interesting to people who've gone through, for example, a difficult phase in their life on a particular medical issue. So you need to adjust your sample, but you also would have to adjust your questions, immediately starting to think about ethical considerations and so on. So start always, like with any good research question, any research project, with the research question, and then follow from there what you want to do. Otherwise, there's a bit of a danger that you jump 3 steps into the way and think about great survey instruments without having actually made sure that it matches your research goal.
Right. Yes, I always encourage people to think of design in a kind of holistic and iterative way, especially, as you're kind of getting the project organized, because as you're saying, I mean, one part would influence other choices. So in your book, you talk quite a bit about different types of questions. Could you just give us kind of an overview of what some of the types of questions are, and why would you choose those, as questions in the instrument?
So yes, exactly. So the most important distinction when we talk about questions is what we refer to as open questions and closed questions. So open questions are the sort of things that you are asking me here in this conversation, where I can give you very open answers. Now, they are great in qualitative research. They're very difficult to deal with in quantitative research, because what I want to do, obviously, with large-scale studies is to summarize information. Now, that's really hard. If I interview 2,000 people for a survey, over 20 minutes, I might collect something like 100 answers. If all of them were open questions, I just have so much text to analyze, it would take me forever. So we typically in surveys work more with closed questions, where we present certain answer categories. But that obviously means you have to think very carefully about those categories. For example, do you want people to evaluate something on a scale from kind of bigger to smaller, or from this, I agree with this, to disagree with this? That works well when you ask about statements that are opinions. It doesn't work so well if you ask people, for example, to tell you things about their living circumstances, where it might be more where you have to distinguish different possible experiences that we know from theory or from research. So in that case, rather than, for example, more numerical or ordinal scales, we might be looking at questions that have discrete categories. There are certain experiences, however, where there isn't a single answer that anyone can meaningfully give. Right? You might find a position on a scale, on a big to small type question, that's fine. But what about questions? Think about things like national identity, for example. For a lot of people, they don't hold one national identity. They might, for example, so I teach at the University of Edinburgh. Most people in Scotland say that they feel both Scottish and British. Some of them on top feel European. Some of them on top feel like citizens of the world. So what you might need to have are also questions where people can not just give one answer, but where they can select multiple answers. So we have single select versus multiple select options. And there is much more. There are obviously great varieties in all of this. But it again brings us back. It's really important that the questions we ask allow people to really validly basically reflect what they're thinking about those sorts of things. So that is the task that we're trying to get at. And when we don't do that, we sometimes get, misleading answers. So you sometimes, if I asked, for example, if I ran a survey in Scotland and asked people, what's your national identity? And people could only choose one. Now you can do that. And then the most common answer might be, for example, Scottish. But if I did that and then reported those results, I would understate how many people also feel British in Scotland, for example. So it wouldn't be a comprehensive assessment. That's why it's so important to think very carefully about questions and study them well and use theory and our knowledge that we have about the context that we ask them in when designing them.
So then, might you look at established instruments that have already been used as one way to find examples from other studies that have been done on the topic you're exploring?
Absolutely. That is always my first recommendations also when I teach survey methods to students, or when I work with practitioners in government agencies, for example, that are designing a survey. Often the sort of things you want to ask about, someone else has probably asked about. And if they've done this, that's fantastic for two reasons. One, if you have a similar sample and a similar sampling approach, you might be able to compare your results to what's out there. So that can be really interesting. But there's a second good reason. If there are instruments that have been shown to work well, especially if they've been conducted in, for example, well-established big surveys like the European Social Survey, or we think in Scotland, the Scottish Social Attitude Survey, in those sorts of contexts, there's a lot of detail goes into the question development and the testing, which is one area I talk about in the book. Many people don't think about, but new questions are often in good surveys tested in a lot of detail with something even where, you check how people respond to them before you actually then administer them. Why it's also really helpful to look at them is basically you might be getting questions that have been established as working. They achieve the sort of things I talked about a moment ago. Having said that, there's always one note of caution, as so often in academic research. That is, when you take a question that has been used somewhere else, you need to make sure that it works in your context too. So, for example, you might be taking a question that's been used in the United Kingdom in a different country, but you want to make sure that the concept you're asking about works in the same way. So some of my research uses instruments from what's called happiness research, subjective well-being research. And what we know is you can ask these questions in different contexts, but that when you ask someone about their cognitive evaluations of their life satisfactions, their well-being, people, for example, in Latin America tend to interpret those questions differently to people in Europe. So that doesn't mean you can't use the question, but you need to understand that you're actually not asking the exact same question in that different context. So you need to make sure when you take an instrument and ask it somewhere else, that it is still applicable. So you might need to do a bit of testing before you translate something. So it's a good idea to look at what's out there, but you want to think about and reflect quite carefully whether it translates well into another context too.
Right. So I know that you've done a lot of work around survey research with youth, and I've invited you to write more about that for Methodspace when we'll be focusing on research across generations in July. So viewers can stay tuned to see more about that. But I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, given the process that you've just described, how would that be different with surveys that you're trying to, when you're trying to learn from young people?
So there are two things that are really, really important when we talk about sampling and surveying young people. One is about the sampling and one is about the questions. On the sampling itself with young people, we need to understand that overall, in most countries, young people are less likely to participate in a survey than older people. So if I, for example, design a sampling strategy in which I want to make sure that I have maybe a bigger sample of young people, so that I can look at different subgroups within young people, I might have to recruit at a higher level in the first place. I might have to invite more young people to take part because their participation rates are lower. So there are certain patterns, even some of the gender patterns that we often find, again, not in all countries, but in quite a few countries, for example, in Europe, women tend to be more likely to participate in social surveys than men. Right. That can sometimes be even stronger amongst younger people. So you have to take that into account when you design your sampling approach, basically, to avoid that you have a big bias in the end that you can only account for by weighting the data post hoc. In terms of the questions, now overall, you can you don't have to patronize young people, and that's really important. It's one of the most negative reactions you get from young people if you start formulating questions in a way where they feel, well, you think I'm a bit stupid, basically. You want to avoid that. So what we did actually, when we did a big project where we interviewed 14 to 17-year-olds, we took questions from established surveys, but before we ran them basically with the younger population, we ran some pilots. We went into some schools, basically administered the survey, and then discussed with young people in focus groups how they felt responding to the questions, which questions they liked, which ones they didn't like. And we did adjust questions, but it was very interesting. We thought we'd have to adjust questions by making them simpler. That wasn't the issue. They understood all the questions. So it wasn't about that. That was more that patronizing mood. So they didn't like it when we insinuated that. But what we did have to do is think about young people's life realities and how certain questions might be interpreted. I give you one example. Okay. We had a question in the survey, this was in Scotland, where people were asked, this was a question about what would happen if Scotland became an independent country. This was when there was a referendum about independence in Scotland. And the standard question asked in loads and loads of surveys of the adult population has always asked, how would you feel? Would you feel happy or sorry about it, basically, if this happened? Now, we asked the same thing to the young people, and in every focus groups, they told us afterwards, that was a really weird question. And we asked them why, and they said, well, why would I be sorry for something that's not my fault? So their interpretation of it was a bit like, a young person being told, you'll be sorry. That was the interpretation that they might have heard from a teacher, from a parent. So their interpretation wasn't, I'm sorry in the sense that I feel sad about it, but I'm sorry because I did something wrong and I'm being told off. So the question didn't work for them because their life reality, basically their experience of how certain language was used was different. So we didn't ask that question in that way with young people. So that is a really good example, I think, to think about it. But the important bit, so when you shift from one population to another that you draw your sample from, as I said before, think about the applicability of the questions, but don't make lazy assumptions, basically, like young people can't handle a more complicated question, but engage with it. Do some of that sort of piloting work that I discussed. And I was really grateful. So for the book, I interviewed people who do this in practice, who work in survey institutes or who work as researchers. And so I have experts speak in the book from those interviews. And I was really grateful to have two people from the Scotland Social Research Institute to talk about how they conduct these sorts of pilots and this sort of cognitive interviewing that allows you to find out whether questions work or not. That was one of the most interesting things for me to also learn more about, because even as an academic, you don't often get the chance to do those things yourself.
Right. So could you just tell us a little bit about the book and who you think might benefit from this?
So the book is really written to be absolutely accessible. So within the kind of the kit that it's a part of, it is probably the least mathematical book, and that is intentional. So it is a book that generates data that can be analyzed statistically, but this book is really accessible to, well, anyone who can read, really. It's not a book for which you need any maths. It's also not trying to be overcomplicated. I'm not going into details of like theories of sampling and so on in a mathematical way, because what I wanted it to be is a book that anyone who's ever thought about either understanding better how surveys work, becoming better at, for example, spotting what things to look out for. So journalists often ask me, what do I need to look for?
Right.
Make sure that I identify a good survey and separate that from bad surveys. So you get that from the book. Or people who might need to commission work like this in an NGO, for example, who say, I need to, do a survey myself and I don't know how to start. It has a lot of practical examples in there. It has case studies of things that went wrong, news stories that give kind of a false impression, and I discuss why. And it has those expert interviews from people who really give insights into common pitfalls in question design, for example. So what I hope is that it's a book for anyone who either feels like they might end up either designing a survey or poll themselves, or might be part of a team. I know loads of people who work in teams where someone else designs surveys, and they often feel like it's a bit of magic happening over there, and they don't contribute as much to the discussion as they'd like to, although they have maybe the topical expertise on the particular issue.
Right.
So it's people who might want to conduct it, are part of teams that do this, or people who will never conduct a survey themselves, but would like to get better at understanding where this data comes from and what to look out for in terms of good or bad survey design. So I think it's useful to students. It's really helpful to academics who might be entering survey research themselves. But it's also really helpful, I think, for researchers in government, civil servants, but also researchers, especially in kind of think tanks, NGOs and so on, who might be touching upon this sort of work as well.
Right. It seems like it's a very practical approach. And I mean, one of the things that I observe, in addition to what you've already described, is that, as we hopefully are coming out of the COVID pandemic, it hasn't completely gone away yet. And some of the kind of more field-based in-person approaches that researchers have used, perhaps just not advisable at this time. So people are looking for new approaches. So I think going back to what I said at the beginning of the purpose of Methodspace in terms of teaching and learning, that you could be a very experienced researcher, but now you find that you need to try something different because of the circumstances that we're in. And I also think that there are many people who are realizing the value of mixed methods and multi-methods. I'm hearing that, from many of the people I interview. And so for someone who has experience as a qualitative researcher, but, wants to either use data that has been generated from other people's surveys, or to conduct a survey as a part of a mixed method study, that this kind of a book would be very useful. You're not going to get lost in the weeds.
That's exactly the idea. And I work with mixed methods. My kind of home is the social survey. But in a lot of projects, I work with collaborators in mixed methods to try and bring ideas together. And I hope that this book, for example, is accessible for people who mostly work on qualitative research, but have an interest maybe in finding out how to engage with some of these things. So yes, absolutely. I think that can work. And I'm very honest in the book. So this isn't the sort of book that tells you this is kind of the only gold standard way of doing surveys. I acknowledge very clearly that sometimes resources are limited and you might not be able to do a big 6 months in the field type survey that spends an hour with every respondent. But as I said earlier, when we talked about kind of quick polling, that isn't an excuse to not do it well. To the contrary, we have gotten much better. Methods that are remote, internet methods and so on, you can actually get for certain populations really quite good data quality, but a lot of what is being done doesn't generate that good quality. You can also get quite shoddy quality. So just because something is online doesn't mean it's bad anymore, but not everything that is online is good. And being able to distinguish this and understand how you can create something really good, for example, in the online space, that is something that I discuss in the book and link to people who've studied this in a lot of detail as well, and make suggestions of what you can do. So hopefully also one thing the book does is you find out which parts of research of this method you might want to learn more about. There are reading recommendations or where you can dig in deeper.
Right.
And there are some recommendations for the people who want the maths. I have some recommendations for the people who write about that. So you can go away and pick those things then if you want, of course.
Well, thank you for taking the time to discuss both the bigger ideas and the book itself. And we'll continue the exploration through future posts on Methodspace as well.
Thank you for having me.